We absolutely support Israel's right to defend itself in line with international law.
We need to safeguard financial stability.
2024 is not going to be an easy year.
We used to call it the dream of home ownership, but look at Britain now.
We've got to hang on to optimism and hope because it is the biggest driver of change.
Let's stop thinking of life in terms of Brexit. Let's move on and look to the future.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Lizzy Burden.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Welcome to the programme. I don't know if you've looked through the list of winners from the Golden Globes last night, Lizzy, but it's always one of those things that when you get up very early in the morning to come to work, as some of us do, it's something that you get to see the awards being announced essentially as you're on your way to work, more or less. So I was watching for some of the TV-related awards, Succession doing very well in the Golden Globes, but it does sort of bring to mind the power of TV drama, and we've seen that play out in the political scene here in the UK because of the ITV drama around the Horizon Post Office scandal dominating the political conversation over the weekend. Of course, MPs back in the House of Commons today, which is back sitting, and that's one of the things they're going to be discussing. Many MPs calling for the post office managers convicted of fraud and theft because of the flood software to have their names cleared. There are meetings taking place about this today. The Economic Secretary to the Treasury, Bim Afalami, has been talking about the need of a sense of urgency in resolving this.
The legal redress has been working too slowly. That's why the Lord Chancellor, as head of the justice system, is now working to see if we can accelerate the process so that nobody has a black stain on their record.
Well, over the weekend, we also heard from the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, and the opposition Labour leader, Keir Starmer. The firing gun on the election very much has been sounded, and both of them in campaign mode. It seems like every broadcast is going to be that way throughout 2024 now. It was interesting, though, to hear Rishi Sunak kind of confirming one of our bits of reporting from Bloomberg on the Rwanda migrant plan. And there had been questions about whether he had doubts over the idea because it was raised under Boris Johnson, of course, when Rishi Sunak was Chancellor, but Sunak appeared on the BBC's programme with Laura Kuenssberg. He said he always backed plans to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda, even when Johnson was Prime Minister. He just had significant doubts, but as you may well do about lots of policies when you're in Cabinet. So interesting to get him on that. And also Starmer really goading Sunak to call this election, saying that he was putting vanity before country, just wanting to clock up 2 years in office before he goes to the polls.
Oof.
And indeed, it does kind of seem that Sunak wants to stay in office as long as possible, but rather to get as much progress as possible under his belt on his 5 priorities. He's achieved 1, but he's some way to go on the other 4.
Well, so that was some of the weekend TV drama. Now to a story that might sound like a TV drama that we're following today. China says it's detained the head of an overseas consulting firm for spying for MI6. The Chinese spy agency says the individual, who it described as being from a third country, provided the UK with state secrets and intelligence. To unpick this, we're joined by our senior UK government reporter Alex Wickham and our resident China expert and Bloomberg TV anchor Tom Mackenzie. Tom, to you first, how unusual is a statement like this from the Chinese Ministry of State Security?
Well, it's unusual on a number of fronts, and in my almost 10 years in China, I do not remember the Ministry of State Security coming out with a statement and with details like this. It's unusual in the format. One, they use WeChat, which is the kind of Chinese equivalent of WhatsApp, but combined with Facebook and TikTok. It's the platform and the app that, frankly, the vast majority of people in China have on their phones. They released the statement on WeChat, and then they gave the details as well. So the details around this alleged individual, who the Chinese officials are saying is called Mr. Huang, who is apparently from a third country, so not from the UK, not from China, recruited from a third country. Again, those are the allegations. And also the Ministry of State Security in China alleging that this individual was trained and equipped here in the UK back in 2015 and encouraged to travel to China to collect information. They say that this individual was collecting state secrets and intelligence and feeding it back to the UK.
So, Alex, what have we learned, what have we heard from the UK side?
Absolutely nothing so far. The British government is sort of maintaining its position that it always has on stories like this, that it just would never comment. However, we are sort of hearing from officials more off the record that they kind of don't recognise essentially what the Chinese government is saying. Well, on the one hand, maybe they would say that. On the other hand, there is this sort of background context here that there is some tit-for-tat squabbling going on at the moment between the UK and China over espionage. Last year, the British government accused China of a series of sort of spying allegations in Britain, and all of a sudden this allegation has cropped up in China in response. It's quite a rare announcement, as we were saying. So I think heavy dose of scepticism from the British side on this at the moment, and it remains to be seen whether they'll sort of come out a bit more forcefully and try to shoot this down.
Tom, this is coming after China's been stepping up anti-spying activities, including opening that WeChat channel that you talked about as well. I mean, what has that entailed, and is this something that's broader than this case involving?
Well, it absolutely is broader, and the context is, of course, Chinese spies have been operating outside of their borders in countries like the UK and other Western nations for decades, as have, of course, UK spies and US espionage assets. Of course, that's been going on for decades. But what really changed was under the Trump administration, the Chinese response to the focus from the Trump administration on tariffs, the targeting of China, was a doubling down in terms of their national security apparatus and a focus and a prioritization of national security and state security under President Xi Jinping. And we've seen that come through. We've seen that with increased anti-espionage laws, so putting more laws on the books. Some of those came through last year. They're very vague in nature, very ill-defined. That, of course, gives officials and those ministries and those law enforcement officers in China wide scope to prosecute those allegations, but of course makes it very difficult for anyone investing there to know where the lines are and what lines you might cross. The consultancy sector has been very hard hit by this, most notably last year. A number of US consultancies probed, researched, and many of their employees quizzed as well by this. So it's a culmination of all these different efforts, but it's worth noting, I think, that this is an administration now in China that prioritizes national security and have really ramped up the ability for the Minister of State Security to take action. And so we should not expect this to be the last announcement, or at least the last action from these officials in China.
And Alex, what does it mean for UK-China relations? Because this seems to be a relationship with multiple personalities.
Yeah, and, Rishi Sunak appointed David Cameron as Foreign Secretary just a few weeks ago. David Cameron is someone who, historically at least, seemed to sort of promote more of a warmer relationship with China than certainly some of the more hawkish elements of the Conservative Party in Britain. Whether or not that is plausible at the moment is another question. I think there will certainly be some renewed voices in Conservative circles to suggest that this is sort of Chinese aggression, basically, against the UK. So certainly a bit of pressure on David Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, to come out and try and reject this and have a little bit of an explanation for what's gone on here. And it does also apply a bit of pressure from the Chinese government on the British government over Britain's own spying allegations against China, which is, I think, what British officials would say is going on today.
Tom, from the Chinese point of view, is this a ratcheting up of tensions with the UK, or is this something more fitting into what you were talking about this broader context of them stepping up sort of a national security approach?
Well, I do think it has to be seen within that context. There may well be a retaliatory nature to this. Certainly, China has a history of retaliating. And given the arrests last year of individuals here in the UK accused of spying for China, it would not be surprising that China would try to find some way to retaliate. But I do also think it is in this broader context of a nation state that has empowered these bodies, these agencies in China, retooled them and given them extra scope because they are so concerned about these, what they see as legitimate risks around espionage. And there have been nationwide campaigns encouraging individuals and citizens in China to watch out for foreign spies, as well as these individual sectors that have been probed, and then these new laws that have come into place to give these agencies and these law enforcement officials more powers.
I'm really glad we've got both of you to give us the long view on the two perspectives. Our senior UK government reporter Alex Wickham and our resident China expert and Bloomberg TV anchor Tom Mackenzie.
Well, let's get the view now from Westminster. We're joined by the Conservative MP for East Worthing and Shoreham, Tim Loughton. Tim, great to have you back with us on the programme. Now, you're one of the MPs who's been sanctioned by China back in 2021 for speaking out over human rights abuses. So we wanted to get your perspective on where Anglo-China relations are now as we're discussing this news of this arrest in China at the moment. I wonder how you view the situation between London and Beijing. Now, we've had accusations, of course, of spying in Westminster as well. Is this a relationship that's getting materially worse?
I think the relationship is in quite a precarious position at the moment, and this latest arrest by the Chinese is nothing new, and they're very good at arresting people who actually have nothing to do with any criminal activity, and they're also very good at sponsoring spies operating within various agencies within the United Kingdom. As you said, we had the story out of the blue last year about Chinese operatives within Parliament itself, although we've still got charges to be made there. I think the biggest issue around Anglo-Chinese relations at the moment is, of course, the Jimmy Lai trial and the completely unjustified persecution of somebody who dared to speak out and stand for freedom and democracy in Hong Kong, which is something now in very short supply. And he is, of course, a British citizen, and it has taken many of us a lot of lobbying of the United Kingdom government to acknowledge that he's not a dual national. He is a British citizen, and as such, absolutely deserves the protection of the British government, and for the Chinese government to realise that they've got this show trial against somebody who is not one of their own citizens. He's a British citizen, and he deserves proper justice, which he's not getting at the moment.
Tim, when we spoke to you last August, you said the government didn't have a clear strategy on China. Now Rishi Sunak has appointed David Cameron as Foreign Secretary. He was famously pro-China, not just while he was in office, but afterwards in his business dealings. Do you think that appointment makes UK policy on China more or less clear?
I think it's too early to tell, and obviously those of us who have been sanctioned by China have been concerned by what was deemed to be the golden age of relations between China and the United Kingdom when David Cameron was the Prime Minister. Since he become Foreign Minister, he has absolutely admitted that that age is long since gone, and he has signed up to the government's policy on China, which is to be certainly sceptical, shall I say the least. And we brought in the last few years, since David Cameron was Prime Minister, a number of measures against China, about scrutinising investment of British companies in China, about Confucius Institutes, about Chinese government and Chinese company involvement in infrastructure projects in the UK, which have been restricted substantially, and that's quite right. And David Cameron has said, and as he must, and it's right he has, that he completely signs up to the government's policy on that. So things have changed. But as I say, I think one of the biggest tests of whether China is interested in being seen as a global player who respects the international rule of law is the prosecution going on at the moment of Jimmy Lai, and that doesn't just have implications for Anglo-Chinese relations, but for the way the rest of the world regards China and the way it's bringing oppression now, I'm afraid, to Hong Kong, as it has through other parts of China, including Xinjiang, Tibet, and elsewhere.
But are you concerned that trial happening at the moment could mean that relations between the UK and China will worsen while that's happening, I suppose, in a related sense?
Well, I think it will certainly worsen if, as I fear will be inevitable, because this is a show trial under a law that has no legitimacy, is that Jimmy Lai is consigned to a long term in prison. That certainly can only damage relationships, not just between China and Britain, because he's a British citizen, but for the whole of the West
as well. I mean, this is a man who didn't flee from Hong Kong. He stood up to face down the Chinese authorities in the interest of free speech. He's a very honourable man. He's not guilty of anything anywhere else in the world, and the Chinese are trying to make an example of him. He's no threat to the Chinese government. And if they were to say, look, we've decided after all we're not going to continue with this prosecution, then I think that would help considerably in trying to thaw the relations between China and Britain and other countries. But if this goes ahead with a conviction, then why are we not sanctioning people? I mean, why is the British government not taking action against those people who have been party to this completely unjustified prosecution circus? In America, they are sanctioning officials in China and in Hong Kong. Why on earth are we not as well? And we will continue to put pressure on the British government to name names and for there to be consequences of the action of the Chinese government.
Well, this is the point that you made when we last spoke as well, as you called for individuals to be sanctioned for these reasons. Why has no progress been made on that sense? Is the government not listening to you and your colleagues?
You raise a very good question, because we are a bit of an outlier on this. While the United States government, through unanimous votes in Congress, is clamping down on Chinese action, is naming names and putting people on sanctions list, as the Chinese have to 5 MPs, 2 members of the House of Lords and others over here. And yet the UK government has not followed suit. We've been sanctioning Russians and others. We have the legislation to do it. We have the processes to do it. But Chinese government names remain off that list, despite the fact that we have a much closer interest than many, particularly in what's going on in Hong Kong. And it's still a bit of a mystery as to why the UK government is not prepared to follow our allies in taking a fairly obvious piece of action. And what we have done is to ban the Chinese ambassador and the embassy staff in London from coming to Westminster. But that was a decision made by Parliament, not by the government. So, as I've said to you before, and all the interviews I've done on this subject, when you're dealing with China, it's not just a question of talking tough, but you have to make it clear that there are consequences if the Chinese government continues with its actions, and be prepared to bring through those consequences. If you don't do something as simple and straightforward as sanctioning key officials who are responsible for some of these abuses of international law, including now the show trial of Jimmy Lai, then the Chinese government just don't think you're serious.
Finally, Tim, briefly, do you worry that this is just going to become another issue that gets sidelined because of the looming election?
Well, it's not the number one issue on the doorstep. I'm afraid I've not had thousands of constituents writing to me about the Jimmy Lai trial, important though it is for international principles and free speech. And so the focus in this country is going to be, of course, on the cost of living, the state of National Health Service, and education, and all lots of domestic things. But I think increasingly people appreciate, certainly since what's been going on in Xinjiang and the oppression of the Uyghurs, that a few years ago nobody would have heard of that. There is a growing realization that actually the way we deal with China and the potential threats that China poses to the United Kingdom and to the Western world need to be taken seriously. We had a really a big wake-up call on Russia over Ukraine, with elections looming in Taiwan itself, and the bellicose mutterings of the Chinese government against Taiwan. These are big global issues that will impact on the UK. So we can't just focus on domestic things in an election year. We have to look globally as well, and China is an important issue, and the way we deal with China is going to have an impact on everybody who will have a vote in the United Kingdom elections later this year.
OK, Conservative MP Tim Loughton, thank you very much for joining us on the programme.
Now, thinking about geopolitical relationships, this year elections will certainly have a bearing on them. In 2024, voters in countries representing almost half the world's population will head to the polls, and things are hotting up here in the UK at least. Over the weekend, we heard from both the Prime Minister and the opposition Labour leader busy staking their claims on the electorate, and Bloomberg's global business columnist Adrian Wooldridge and editor-in-chief John Micklethwaite have a new column out this week discussing this crucial year for countries around the world. Well, Caroline Hepker and I spoke to Adrian earlier this morning, and we started out by asking him about his global outlook for 2024. Take a listen.
It's pretty bad. I mean, what we say in the column is that there is a 10% chance that things will be good. Now, that's a 90% chance that things will be bad. But I think we are trying to argue that we shouldn't completely discount the idea that some things at least might go right. Now, one obvious thing that will go right, I think, is that we will get a new government in Britain with a new legitimacy, which is, a Starmer government, which will have a certain honeymoon and a certain momentum. So that will be one good thing in the democratic world. But there are a number of other things that we try and point to that indicate that, things might go right. One of them is that you might not get a presidential election in the United States that features Joe Biden and Donald Trump. We might actually get a better set of choices.
Well, one of the headaches for Keir Starmer was his position on the Israel-Gaza war. You write that the Israeli assault on Gaza has split the democratic world. How do you think it's going to play into the elections that we see throughout 2024?
That's a very, very difficult question to answer. It's very difficult to see what the dynamics are, but there is some sense of things getting better, that the Israelis, I think, have made more progress in getting what they wanted than they expected, faster progress, and so they might be moving towards trying to resolve this issue. So there might be a calming down in the blockade and the bombardment, and there might be some move towards peace. And I think you're beginning to get agitation in Israel to get beyond the Netanyahu government. People are now back on the streets protesting. So I think you might, by the end of this year, have a more moderate government in Israel and cessation of bombardment in Gaza and some sort of sense that you need to have a negotiation. We won't have a negotiated settlement by then, but we may be moving from a world in which there's just hostility and bombardment to one in which there's talk and thinking of, learning to live with each other a bit better.
Yeah, indeed. The optimistic case, no doubt. You mentioned, though, the possibility that US voters might have something more than a kind of rematch of Trump-Biden. How likely is that really? And who do you think are the runners and riders? What could be the upset? I mean, we're already at the beginning, in the foothills of what is a very long battle in the US.
Well, let me repeat. What we're talking about is a 10% world. We're saying that there's a 10% chance of things going well. We're not trying to be blindly optimistic. But, the situation in America at the moment looks extraordinarily bad. You have a choice between Joe Biden, who is 81 years old and shows it, I would say, and what looks to be Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the person that the Republican Party seems to be aligning behind. But I think, again, by November, we may get a different dynamic. We may get a shift in the Republican Party towards a different candidate. And I think Nikki Haley has been doing well in the debates. She's a plausible candidate. And she's a lot more sensible and sane, should I say, than Donald Trump is, or a lot more reasonable than Donald Trump is in her approach. So, and I think if you get the Republican Party moving towards a different candidate, then that will set up a bit of a panic within the Democratic Party, and they might move. Let's say Gavin Newsom who's the governor of California, has been positioning himself as an alternative to Biden. So a very bad choice, Biden versus Trump, might be replaced by a much better one with younger, more dynamic, and on the Republican side, more sensible candidate.
Adrian, with your global business hat on, I wonder if you could settle something for me. A very wise veteran of British business said to me that if Donald Trump emerges the victor and Marine Le Pen in France, it's going to be great for Britain because you'll have lots of businesses coming to London. Do you think that's really true?
Oh, absolutely. I think that if one big bonus for Keir Starmer, if he becomes Prime Minister by the end of the year, which is very likely, is that if Trump does win in the United States, he'll be able to say to a lot of Democratic, liberal-leaning businesses, why stay in the United States, which is being riven by, the culture wars, and which has a very unstable president. Why not move here? And there are a lot of mobile businesses. If you look at the world of hedge funds, if you look at the world of financial management in general, if you look at biotech, if you look at high tech, why wouldn't you want to be in London rather than in New York? And actually, London's rather a nicer place to be at the moment than New York. I think that New York's, very bad homeless problem. If you have an unstable president, it's great for Biden. I think also it's great for Starmer. And I also think that with what's going on in the American universities at the moment, Harvard and the rest, which are being torn apart by the culture wars, which are really not very pleasant places to be because of the degree of vitriol on both sides of the divide. He might say, well, why not teach in Oxford? Why not teach in Cambridge?
So that was Bloomberg's global business columnist Adrian Wooldridge with his thoughts on what's shaping up to be a big year for politics and geopolitics.
Yeah, fascinating, keeping us busy as well. Before we go, just wanted to update you on a story that we talked about on Friday on the programme. You'll remember that we were talking about the risk of local councils running out of money after the series of effective bankruptcy declarations we had from some big councils, notably Birmingham. Over the weekend, we learned that government ministers are quietly working on a plan to loosen budget rules for councils that would allow them to sell off assets to fund frontline services. Our colleague Tom Rees reporting that the measures, if adopted, could unlock £23 billion for local government. So this could be a sharp relaxation of the current rules around this as well. Something that we heard from the Minister Laura Trott over the weekend about this as well, looking at it, saying that she wouldn't support any selling off of community assets in an interview on Times Radio, but definitely one to watch from here on out as well. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars wherever you listen to us, Apple, Spotify or elsewhere.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and our audio engineer was Mariful Hussain. I'm Lizzy Burden.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.